Okay, good afternoon and welcome to everyone. My name is Bindi Sawchuk. I'm the Assistant Deputy Minister for Housing and Land Use Policy in the Ministry of Housing. Thank you for joining this webinar today. I am joining from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen speaking people known today as the Esquimalt and Songhees First Nations, and I encourage you to reflect on the territories that you are also joining this conversation from. Uh, there are many of you here, probably close to 600 right now. We've had about 900 people register, so many more may be joining over the next few minutes. And given the volume of people who have shown interest in this, we have decided the best way to make use of your time is to do this in a webinar format and to use Zoom as a platform. So throughout the presentation, you can enter your questions in the QA function at the bottom. Please feel free to upvote questions that are posted. That really helps us prioritize the importance of the questions in terms of answering them. We did a similar webinar a couple of days ago with a smaller audience, and the amount of time that we have allowed for quite a number of questions to be answered. And when we get to that part of the webinar, we'll get more information for you on that. So I'll give you an overview of the bills 44, 46, 47. It'll probably take about 30 minutes, and then we'll start answering questions at that point. We have a little less than 2 hours scheduled in our time today, and we'll likely use all of that time. Before starting, I'd like to introduce the key leads on my team that are supporting these changes. We have Jessica Brooks, who's the Executive Director of the Planning and Land Use Management Branch. Avery Kelly, who's the director responsible for the Small Scale Multi-Unit Housing Initiative. Eric Nichols, who's the director leading our proactive planning and zoning changes. Leslie Scowcroft, a director who is leading the local government development finance changes. Rebecca Pence, a director who is supporting the reason why you're here today, all of our engagement and stakeholder relation work associated with these changes. And Mark Sadaway, a manager who has been supporting on the transit-oriented development area work. We also have folks from the Ministry of Transportation and Infrastructure with us today, Shannon Price, Executive Director of Integrated Development, and Teresa O'Donnell, who is supporting with this transit-oriented development area work. Slide 2, please. As I'm sure you're all aware, we've had a very busy fall legislative session. If you're on this call, you likely work with or for local government and have a very big role to play in implementing all of the changes that were brought forward. This is the first in a series of information webinars that we'll be offering over the coming weeks and months. So we'll be giving an overview of all the changes, what local governments need to do to meet the requirements, and also the supports and resources that are available. In the coming weeks, we have webinars scheduled that will provide a lot more technical detail on small-scale multi-unit housing and also on transit-oriented development areas. So please make sure to sign up for those webinars to get more of your specific technical questions answered. We'll also be scheduling webinars for housing needs reports and short-term rental changes and other priorities that emerge in the weeks to follow. So November 30th, at the end of the fall legislative session, government passed a suite of housing legislation to deliver more homes for people faster in every part of the province. And today we're really focusing our overview on Bill 44, which includes enabling small-scale multi-unit housing, like townhomes, triplexes, and laneway homes, and fixing some outdated zoning rules by shifting toward a more proactive long-term approach to planning. Bill 46, which is expanding development cost charges and development cost levies and adding a new amenity charge tool. And Bill 47, which facilitates more housing density around transit services through the transit-oriented development areas. On slide 4, I'm going to start by focusing in on small-scale multi-unit housing. This, as many of you know, refers to a range of buildings and housing unit configurations that can provide more affordable and diverse options than single-family homes currently do. Some of the typical examples are secondary suites in single-family dwellings, accessory dwelling units like detached garden suites or laneway homes, triplexes, houseplexes, and townhomes. So the small-scale multi-unit housing legislation removes barriers in zoning to make it easier to build this kind of housing form. The regulations detail the requirements for local governments to update zoning bylaws to allow for secondary suites and ADUs throughout the province. 3 or 4 units, depending on lot size, on traditional single-family lots and duplex lots in many, probably most communities in the province, and 6 units on a single-family or duplex lot near frequent bus stops. Small-scale multi-unit housing will apply in all municipalities and regional districts except the Islands Trust. The legislation applies in zones that are restricted to single-family and duplex. Where there are requirements for 3, 4, or 6 units, it'll um, I apologize here, stumbling a little bit. That includes single-family and duplex zones where secondary suites and ADUs are also currently allowed. In most electoral areas, the only the requirement to zone for a secondary suite or ADU will apply, and the requirements for 3, 4, and 6 units apply inside an urban containment boundary established by a regional growth strategy. So if an electoral area falls inside one of those boundaries, it could be captured by the legislation, assuming no other exemption applies. The requirements for 3, 4, 6 units also apply to municipalities with a population over 5,000. And the requirements will apply within an urban containment boundary that's established by an OCP and communities that have a population over 5,000. The requirements for 6 units apply in the same communities, on lots of a minimum size and within 400 meters of a bus stop with a prescribed service level and frequency. I definitely encourage you to attend the small scale multi-unit housing webinar for more details on and discussion on these requirements. Slide 6, there are some exemptions for the small scale multi-unit housing legislation. At a high level, the legislative changes do not apply to lands that are subject to the Islands Trust Act or Rural Land Use Bylaw. Doesn't apply to manufactured home zones and some hazard areas. For the 3 to 6 unit requirement only, there are some other exemptions that apply. So, properties that are currently subject to certain heritage protections, although I will note that you can go forward and still create heritage designations going forward. Those need to also include the minimum allowable density. Properties that are not connected to a local government water or sewer service for obvious reasons. Properties within a designated transit-oriented development area, because those areas will be subject to higher minimum levels of density. Lots that are equal to or greater than 4,050 meters square or within a zone that has a minimum lot size equal to or greater than that for a subdivision, again, because there is greater density that can be applied there. So for more information on these types of exemptions, you can check out the policy, the site standard manual and policy guidance that's in there. Local governments can apply for extensions to realize infrastructure upgrades or other extraordinary circumstances. An application for extension needs to be made by June 1st, 2024 for infrastructure upgrades, or by June 30th for extraordinary circumstances. An extraordinary circumstance is a situation that would result in the kind of diversion from local government resources that you wouldn't be able to comply with the legislation within the specified time frame. For example, major wildfires or floods, those kinds of things. Extensions can be granted by the minister up till December 31st, 2030. So that's the maximum extension period. And we'll be issuing a policy bulletin along with the extension application form in the coming weeks. So by June 30th, 2024, all local governments will need to update their zoning bylaws to comply with the small scale multi-unit housing requirements, except where extensions are granted. As soon as the zoning bylaws are updated, local governments need to give a written notice and identify the land where any exemptions may apply. Local governments need to consider the policy manual and site standards throughout the implementation and not hold a public hearing for a bylaw that is only for the purpose of implementing small scale multi-unit legislation. The Policy manual supports implementation by setting some clear expectations for setbacks, height restrictions, parking, and lot coverage. For municipalities with similar or aligned policies, and there are some, for example, Victoria, Vancouver, Kelowna, Kimberley, the expectation is that existing bylaws will be reviewed for alignment with the small scale multi unit housing requirements and really encouraging those local governments to adopt the provincial site standards on setbacks, height restrictions, parking, and lot coverage in the policy manual to reduce any potential restrictive barriers and create more consistency. Um, I may have mentioned earlier the small scale multi unit housing webinars will begin. Um, there's one on January 16th for secondary suites, one on January 17th, and also one on January 23rd. These will provide more in depth overview on all the requirements and give an opportunity to get down into really detailed questions and answers. The policy manual is available on the Ministry of Housing website, where we are posting all related and relevant information and updates. All future guidance will be posted there, like manuals and bulletins, and you can sign up to receive updates on that information regularly. So, the second part of Bill 44 is the proactive planning, and this shift will address some inconsistencies that currently exist and really help to ensure better upfront planning and taking a longer term approach. This involves standardizing housing needs reports, ensuring adequate housing in official community plans, aligning zoning bylaws with official community plans, and moving away from site by site rezoning and spot zoning. Slide 11. To implement the proactive planning, all local governments will need to update housing needs reports using a standard methodology for more consistent, robust understanding of current anticipated local housing needs. And this will be the 20-year total number of housing units that are needed. All local governments need to complete an interim housing need report by January 1st, 2025. Municipalities will also need to update official community plans every 5 years and ensure that the OCP provides for the 20-year total of housing units that are needed. Municipalities also need to complete their first review and update of the official community plans based on an interim housing need report by December 31st, 2025. From there, municipalities will also need to align zoning bylaws with their OCP and H&R to pre-zone for the 20-year total amount of housing units that are needed. The first update of the zoning bylaw needs to be complete by December 31st, 2025. There are some additional improvements to OCPs that apply to both municipalities and regional districts. That is, the OCPs need to plan for housing over a longer time frame, now over 20 years instead of 5, and OCPs need to include policies that address a broader range of housing type, like family housing, senior housing, and housing for people that are at risk of homelessness. To speed up the building of homes and support this proactive planning approach, one off site by site public hearings for rezonings are being phased out for projects with at least 50% housing that are consistent with OCPs. Instead, there will be more frequent opportunities for people to be involved in shaping their communities earlier in the process when OCPs are being updated. Public hearings will continue to be required whenever local governments update or develop a new OCP or consider rezonings for projects that are not consistent with OCPs. And for rezonings of other kinds of land use like commercial, industrial, agricultural, local governments will still be able to choose to hold public hearings if they want. People will also be able to engage as they currently do and will continue to do with their local government in a range of ways through other channels and forums. So, so what's different? What's it going to look like? This is a bit of a visual snapshot of what the process will look like based on all of these changes. Initially, the housing needs report will be updated. From there, there is an update to the OCP so that it accommodates the housing needs that have been identified in the housing need report. And at this point, public engagement is undertaken to really make sure that the OCP reflects public feedback based on these changes. And then zoning bylaws are updated to match the needs that have been outlined in the HNR and OCP. Applications that come in are reviewed by local government applications for housing. When a home builder brings forward plans that fit within the zoning bylaws and the OCP, the applicable permits are approved by the local government and the project can move forward. The intention is to rely less on the site-specific rezoning processes and related public hearings and conduct all of that planning and engagement upfront earlier in the OCP update step. So I think overall, this will allow applications to move forward more quickly to the required permit approval stage. Housing needs report guidance will be released in early 2024, and this will be posted on the website with all of the other materials. There will also be a webinar once that material is released to support implementation, to walk through the standard methodology and answer questions. Guidance will be provided to municipalities to update official community plans and zoning bylaws later in 2024. And I have a bit more detail on that in the upcoming slides. Shifting now to Bill 46 on development finance, we know that new housing supply creates demand for new and expanded infrastructure and amenities and services. And this legislation provides new and updated development finance tools to assist local governments to effectively be able to fund the costs of infrastructure and amenities to support this increased growth. These changes include new categories for DCCs and DCLs and introduces a new development finance tool, the amenity cost charge. Changes to DCC and DCL frameworks update the scope of infrastructure that's eligible to be funded to include fire protection facilities, police facilities, and solid waste facilities. The DCC and DCL frameworks have been updated to include cost-shared provincial highway projects as well, like interchanges and highway exits. Local governments will need to amend existing DCC DCL bylaws to use the new authorities or adopt a DCC bylaw if they currently don't have one and want to go forward using one. All of the other rules related to DCCs and DCLs remain the same. The new amenity cost charge tool, which is optional, much like a DCC or DCL tool, allows local governments to impose charges on new development to assist in paying for the capital cost of community amenities like community centers, rec centers, libraries, in the areas where local governments are planning for and expect an increase in population growth and housing supply. The new tool needs to be brought into force by bylaw and is designed to become a regular part of the long-term planning process. ACCs can be waived or reduced for affordable rental housing like a DCC can, and they cannot be used to help fund infrastructure that could be funded using a DCC or DCL. The ACC tool contains mechanisms to really help ensure transparency and cost certainty, both for developers, local governments, and the public. So, to implement the amenity cost charge tool, a local government will need to identify the area where more housing supply is planned. This is based on official community plans and other planning documents, and then also determine what the amenities are that are needed in that area to support the increased growth. The ACCs would apply to the new development in those areas. Determining the ACC amounts is done by following a set of rules that are laid out in the legislation. For example, figuring out what the capital costs are and then allocating them between existing and new users. Local governments will need to consider whether the charge amount would deter development, so an economic analysis will be needed. And local governments also need to consult during the development of the ACC bylaw and the charge rates that are being considered. And then, of course, after all of that, local governments would pass a bylaw that implement the charges. All of the ACCs that are collected also need to go into a dedicated reserve fund, and there is annual reporting requirements based on the collection of ACCs and what's in that fund. So, interim guidance on the amenity cost charge tool and the new DCC and DCL categories. Guidance will be made available later, like it'll be in the next couple of months. And more comprehensive guidance is being developed for both of those to be released in summer or early fall 2024. All of this supporting information will be posted on the website where we're posting all the information. And then turning our attention to Bill 47, so transit-oriented development areas. The new legislation will require some local governments to designate TOD areas near transit hubs. In these areas, local governments are required to follow a set of provincial standards to permit a minimum allowable amount of residential density. Next slide, please. So in these areas, the local governments need to ensure that the minimum levels of density sought by size and dimension that have been established through regulation are allowed in the TOD areas. These vary by municipality and they can even vary within the TOD area itself. Local governments can approve densities that exceed the provincial regulations at their discretion. But within those transit-oriented development areas, a local government can't deny an application within the allowable density based on density. They also can't require off-street parking, although disability parking minimums and parking for other kinds of, amenities are allowed. Local governments can approve densities. Oh, I already talked about that. Local governments also need to consider the provincial policy manual when they're making land use decisions in the TOD areas and update their bylaws to reflect the new off-street parking rules. So there's a series of steps, and there's lots of information in the transit-oriented development area manual. But at a high level, when designating the TOD areas, local governments need to confirm the transit station category, confirm the locations and types of transit-oriented areas, confirm the density that's required, map out all of the transit-oriented development areas, designate those areas by bylaw, um, prepare transit-oriented development area plans. This is optional, but highly encouraged, and then implement the density requirements. So the policy manual sets out the provincial expectations for implementing these requirements and making zoning decisions and updating the parking bylaws. There will be more in-depth TOD webinars that begin next week with a session on January 18th for municipalities in the Metro Vancouver area and a session on January 25th for all other municipalities. Slide 24, many of you may have seen this in news releases and other things, but this is the list of the transit-oriented development areas that are in effect now, and the ones that need to be designated by June 30th, 2024. This list is also available on the website, so if you want to go and check it out, I guess we're going to keep moving on. There's a place where there's pretty easy access to that information. So we recognize the considerable amount of work that's required to implement all of these changes. And I do want to say that we really are aware of that. I don't mean to speak about it tongue in cheek. We've thought a lot about it. We've talked a lot about it. And so in addition to all of the guidance material and policy manuals, we want to highlight some of the resources that are available to support your work. There is $51 million in capacity funding. This is really to support you with the necessary planning that's needed to meet these legislative requirements. A letter has been sent out to local governments in December notifying you of the amounts of funding that you'll be receiving. The funding itself will be distributed by the end of this month. There will be a requirement to report back on the work that's completed related to this funding. There's also $10 million in the LGDAP funding. So UBCM has started to accept applications for that. You can find information if you're not aware of it on the UBCM website. That will be open for applications until March 8th. And of course, the purpose of this funding is really to support local governments with improving development approval processes, which all of this work is directly aligned with. And then the peer learning network is really being designed to support local governments to learn from one another and share resources. This network is being led by the Planning Institute of BC, and we'll have more details on this in the coming weeks. Um, so before we move into questions, I just wanted to give you a quick overview of what the next steps look like moving forward. Obviously, in the winter here, there are a number of funding opportunities. By June 30th, 2024, zoning bylaws need to be updated to accommodate for small-scale multi-unit housing zoning, and all 104 transit-oriented development areas need to be designated by bylaw. By January 1st, 2025, local governments need to have an interim housing needs report complete. And by December 31st, 2025, municipalities have to have updated OCPs and zoning bylaws to reflect their housing needs. I did want to say we recognize that all of these changes will have an impact on local government's ability to negotiate certain outcomes, including things like affordable housing, statutory rights of way, tenant protections, and things like that, that typically have gone along with rezoning processes. We're mindful of the impacts and we're looking at some potential future changes to help address them, such as potentially introducing a new inclusionary zoning tool and some other things. So slide 27, this is a quick snapshot of the dates and times of the upcoming webinars that have been scheduled. And again, we will be scheduling more webinars in addition to these in the coming weeks, and we'll make sure that invitations go out as soon as those things are being scheduled. Thank you for your attention and for listening to me go on a little bit about all of the detail. I'd now like to turn it over to Jessica Brooks to facilitate some questions and answers.
Thanks very much, Bindi, and thanks to everybody who's taken the time to join us today on the call. There's a lot of folks here, creeping up on close to 800 now, it looks like. So to be able to get through as many questions as we can, we're just going to limit the use of microphones and request that people put their questions directly into the Q&A function, which you'll see located at the bottom of your screen, just in between the chat and participant functions as well. In terms of process, just a bit of housekeeping. I'm just going to go through the Q's and A's and read them out loud for direct response from the various team members that we have on the call today. I will be doing that in sequential order. So you'll see, and many of you have already started using the upvoting function. So if there's a question that you see go in that is of particular interest to you, please do feel free to upvote it, because it'll make sure that we're able to address the questions that are of the most interest to participants. Given the numbers on today's call, it's likely that there will be more questions than we're able to respond to in today's session. So I just want to note that up front. Further to Bindi's point, I would encourage everybody to sign up for the upcoming webinars that we have, in particular on small scale multi-unit housing and TOD, but there will be other ones as well. And I'll note too that those sessions may also be good venues if you've got specific questions related to those topics today. I'll also just note and remind everybody that there are very detailed policy manuals available for both small-scale multi-unit housing and transit-oriented development. The team's going to drop the links to those manuals into the chat, so you'll have direct access to them. If you haven't had a chance to look at them yet, I would encourage you to do so. There's a lot of good information in there, and they really do a good job in articulating provincial kind of policy expectations for those two particular streams of work. At the end of the session today as well, we will be reviewing any outstanding questions. And as we see emerging issues starting to come up, we may look at scheduling some additional webinars or Q&A sessions. So please do stay tuned. The easiest way to be kept kind of up to date on any new information or new webinars is to sign up for updates on our web pages. So if you just go to those pages, you can sign up there. And we did just finally notice that there were a few process-related questions that came up in the Q&A chat yesterday. If we see some of those come up again, we'll do our best to just answer them directly in the chat rather than reading them through. So without further ado, we have about a little over an hour, so we'll start going through the Q's and A's now. And I'll just start with the first one we have here. Now that sorry. every time a new one gets added, my screen gets bumped. So now that a municipality can't hold a public hearing on a zoning bylaw that is applicable under the Local Government Act, is it correct in interpreting that a municipality can now give all readings and adopt a zoning amendment bylaw in the same meeting? So basically, can they go through all readings in one meeting? Eric, can I turn that over to you?
Sure. Thank Jessica. That aligns with our understanding for sure that you can move ahead with a rezoning bylaw in a single meeting. But as with any matter of interpretation, I think it's just good to remind everyone that it's prudent to check with your own legal advice internally to ensure that all of your internal procedures and other policies and interpretation of the legislation are lined up.
Great, thanks, Eric. And then the next question we have here, Avery, I'll ask you to respond to this briefly. Will the ministry be providing information on where prescribed bus stops are?
Thanks. We don't have a data set to share per se at this moment, but certainly the request for more support identifying those bus stops is acknowledged, and we'll provide a bit more technical guidance in the webinars that are dedicated to small scale multi-unit housing next week.
Great, thanks. And Avery, maybe while I've got you on the line too, can you just speak a little bit to how frequent transit is being defined?
Sure. So the bus stops that the 6-unit requirements apply to are defined in a regulation associated with the legislation. And so those bus stops are defined as stops that meet a certain level service and frequency level. And that's where one route stops at that bus stop on average 15 minutes all day between 7 a.m. and 7 p.m. Monday to Friday, and then between 10 and 6 on Saturday and Sundays. And that's an average of every 15 minutes. So there could be longer headways off peak hours and shorter headways during peak hours, but as long as the average daily average is 15 minutes.
Great, thanks. And I think, is it fair to say that that definition is also contained in the policy manual for small scale multi-unit housing? Yeah,
Certainly.
So folks can refer to that too, rather than trying to frantically take notes if need be. The next question we have here is regarding any existing infrastructure needs and how they may be addressed, for example, through exemptions or similar in some of the policies. So Avery, while I've got you, do you maybe want to speak to that a little bit in the context of small scale multi-unit housing?
For the small scale multi-unit housing requirements, there will be an extension process for local governments in the case where infrastructure upgrades that service specific areas where the requirements are to be implemented, if they have infrastructure upgrades underway, or if infrastructure upgrades are needed, there's an opportunity to apply for an up to 5-year extension, and the province will issue a policy bulletin and the application process for those extensions in the coming weeks.
Great, thank you. Teresa, I'm not sure if there's anything that you would add in that space in relation to TOD.
I think Avery's done a great job. Of course, in TOD for the higher density radiuses, the province is not requiring pre-zoning, so you'll still have the zoning process to secure those exactions, and also through DP.
Thanks, Teresa. Looking at the next question, will the province be providing guidance on how a local government can now obtain road dedications? Eric, are you able to speak to that a little?
Sure. Going back to something Bindi briefly mentioned earlier in the presentation, road dedications is something we've heard consistently from local governments as one of the outcomes that rezonings are used to secure. And so that's one of the items we're looking at closely right now, and to see if to better understand the nature of that gap and what might be done to respond to it.
Thanks, Eric. Sorry, my screen's just scrolled right down to the bottom again. So the next question is in relation to parking provisions. It says Bill 44. So, sorry, I'm just looking at the question here. So is the intention of Bill 44 to restrict municipal ability to require bicycle parking, accessible parking, and other TDM measures? There doesn't seem to be a clear mechanism for either Bill 44 or 47. So I think maybe if we want to start with Bill 47, which is, I think, probably the bigger component of that question. Teresa, can I start with you, or maybe you want to ask Mark to weigh in?
Sure, I'll give it a try, and then Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but Bill 47 only restricts the requirement of off-street parking for residential uses, not for handicap uses. If it's a mixed-use project, it doesn't restrict the cities from requiring off-street parking for commercial, office, any of those mixed uses. And it's silent on bicycle parking. So Mark, I don't think we've precluded that. Can you clarify that for the group?
Again, yeah, I suggest actually just passing over to Eric about we're aware of the securing TDM measures, so I was wondering if Eric can step in on that one.
Sure, thanks, Mark. Yeah, like with road dedications, this is another area that we've heard pretty consistently from a wide range of local governments that that they would appreciate greater clarity and authority to require things like bike parking and TDM measures. And so here too, it's something we're looking at in the short term as part of our effort to ensure that the shift away from spot zoning and towards pre-zoning is as well supported as possible.
Great, thanks team. Looking at the top of my screen, the next question. So acknowledging that there is a requirement to provide public notice when a local government is not holding a public hearing, how can a council, or how are they expected to receive comments and consider them? Eric, while you're on my screen.
Yep, thanks Jessica. So as I think most of you know, in 2021, there was already an initial legislative change to make it easier for local governments to not hold a public hearing for rezonings that were consistent with bylaws. The latest changes build on that. And for that and other reasons, we know lots of local governments have already been receiving comments outside of the public hearing process. And so that's an area where existing meeting and feedback procedures in the municipality or the regional district would be relevant and worth looking at. Might also be a place for shared best practices between local governments, but certainly we anticipate in the absence of public hearings that depending on the issue, local governments will be getting written or other feedback outside of by email or by letter or by phone call.
Thanks, Eric. Avery, this next question, I think, is for you in relation to small-scale multi-unit housing. On exemptions related to water and sewer services, is the exemption for where it is outside a water and service area or where it's not yet connected to a water and sewer service?
Thanks. So the exemption is on a parcel basis. So for any parcels that are not currently connected to municipal water or sewer, they would be exempt, or you could exempt them. Don't have to exempt them though. So if they are intended to be attached to municipal water and sewer in the very near future, local governments are free to pre-zone those areas now, but they could also exempt them if they chose.
Great, thanks. Next up, we've got a TOD question. Teresa, is there any consideration being given to allowing some flexibility on the boundaries of identified TOAs?
That's a great question. It came up in our last seminar. There is no exemption provision in the regulations now, and the manual doesn't spell one out. It is something, as we continue to hear from local governments about meeting the intent of the legislation and how the it's actually working on the ground as it's applied. I think there is a desire to continue to look at that on the part of Modi, but at this point in time, there is no exemption. So local governments will be required to designate all of those entire areas before the summer.
Great, thank you. Next question pertaining to the consultation process that was used in the development of this legislation. So I'm certainly, and whether there are any ongoing opportunities. So I can speak briefly to that. In the course of developing all of these different initiatives, we spoke to a very broad number of both local governments, regional districts, municipalities from different regions across the province, different kind of staff representatives. We also spoke to the development sector. We consulted with First Nations and the nonprofit sector. So there was quite a lot of engagement in this space. Certainly, you know, the work on these items has concluded, as evidenced by the legislation that was just passed this past November. However, you know, we are always open to feedback as you are working to implement these changes, and we will be monitoring how that's going for folks. And so if you have questions or you're identifying ways that we could be improving things, certainly we are always open to hearing that and would encourage folks to reach out directly to us. Moving on to the next question, looks like a public hearing question, Eric. Is there a cutoff for when public comments must be received? And if so, does it need to be stated in the notice? The asker is just hoping to clarify if first reading is essentially the cutoff where a public hearing isn't required.
I think the answer to that question is a little bit context specific as to what the schedule for the readings will be, is planned to be in the meetings. Certainly it's probably useful in the notice itself, if not required, to at least put a time or a date at which responses or feedback would be considered or due. But beyond that, again, kind of further to my earlier comment, I would encourage local governments to make sure that their meeting and procedure bylaws are kind of reflective of you know, the new reality. Keeping in mind that this is relates to a subset of rezonings, those relating to housing, and not that are consistent with the OCP, and not to rezonings writ large.
Thanks, Eric. Next question, can ACCs be used to support non-market housing? And if not, what's the preferred mechanism for local governments to secure contributions from new development for affordable housing as an amenity? Leslie, can I turn that to you?
Yeah, so amenity cost charges are meant to be used for amenities. So not in relation to affordable housing, which is really requires a different kind of consideration. Density bonus, existing legislative tools are density bonusing, so density bonusing can still be used. We do understand that there is that this does leave some room for potential new tools, and we are working on exploring tools to ensure local governments have what they need to support affordable housing in their communities. I'll note that like DCCs, ACCs can also be waived or reduced for basically affordable rental housing. Thanks.
Thank you. Next question is whether there will be any funding available for infrastructure. I will just note the province fairly recently just provided $1 billion to local governments directly to support infrastructure investments. And certainly, you know, we are aware of the critical connection between increasing density, population growth, and infrastructure needs. And it is something that we continue to monitor and pay close attention to. Eric, can you, I think this was mentioned in the presentation, but can you just provide another quick update on when local governments can expect updated regulations and guidance on the housing needs report requirements?
Sure, thanks, Jessica. We've spent a fair bit of effort engaging with experts and developing the new standardized method that will be used for housing needs reports. And in concert with some colleagues, we're just, in a sense, finalizing those. So we hope to have those out as soon as possible early this year. And like Bindi said earlier, when that happens, there will be both it'll be communicated with guidance and likely a webinar like this.
Thanks. The next question, I believe we've already covered. It's a question regarding road dedications, something that we are aware of and contemplating. The next question following from that is again about public hearings. So the question is essentially, is collecting input and providing submissions to staff problematic from the perspective of the new legislation? So for example, providing submissions to public notices in a correspondence package, for example.
So I think what I'll do here is just talk about the intent of the legislation, which is really to ensure that housing-related projects moved forward expeditiously where they were already aligned with the OCP. And so, you know, the focus here is on not relitigating housing at every juncture. And so, you know, to my earlier comments, would encourage local governments to think about their procedures and the policies they have in place for accepting and you know, responding to input from the public, and to understand how those sort of fit into their the timing and the agendas of their various meetings. Of course, depending on the project scale, there may be other public engagement opportunities that are happening either by the developer or by the local government that might make sense in a particular context, but not in others. So this one too is relatively context dependent.
Thanks, Eric. And I'm going to keep you on the screen to respond to this next question, which is about pre-zoning. Noting that pre-zoning over a 20-year horizon creates a potential risk for partial development in multiple areas. Are there plans to kind of consider and address this risk or ensure that, you know, a sequencing around development phasing?
So there's a couple different you know, angles to that question. One is that under the pre-zoning requirements specifically, that's the need for municipalities, not regional district, but municipalities to align their OCPs and zoning bylaws to provide within those enough capacity to meet the 20-year total number of homes identified in the housing needs report. There's a fair bit of flexibility as to where in the community local governments provide for that capacity. So there can be kind of a logical you know, distribution of added development, housing development capacity, you know, with that in mind. Of course, in addition to that, the communities that are subject to the small scale multi-unit housing provisions in particular will have some broader applicability of zone capacity effectively across, in some cases, quite a bit of their community, although albeit at a lower density. So here too, you know, the situation will differ from community to community, but to respond to the question, we don't have a particular mechanism to sort of slow down development in one place or another. That's really left up to the local government to manage through permitting processes and other pieces as well as needed.
Thanks, Eric. So the next question talks about a bit about and acknowledges some of the challenges inherent in getting folks engaged in and out to participate in OCP planning processes, and is asking the question about whether the province would be willing to help local governments with a public education campaign around supporting BC residents and understanding the importance of OCPs. I think, you know, Eric, you may have some thoughts on this too. Certainly this isn't something that we have been directly contemplating, but we're always interested in understanding where supports might be helpful and useful. I think, you know, our expectation is as we start to shift into a system that emphasizes pre-zoning, there will be a corresponding increase of interest, public interest in OCP processes. But if there are places that the province can support that, certainly we're interested and open in hearing about that and understanding them. Eric, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, just I think you know, that's a great idea, and that's something that we can take away. I think we've already seen a few examples of local governments in either before the changes or just even in the last few months starting to think about as part of their OCP and community planning exercise how they bring in a diverse range of voices that are representative of the full community, which was, as many of you know, quite a challenge often with public hearings. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there, both with open invitations and engagement to the community at large, but also initiated by the local government with targeted engagement with groups that often aren't represented well in the public hearings to kind of get that input. You know, the frequency of OCP updates for municipalities is going to be every 5 years, so that should in the future provide you know, sufficient time to really have that robust community conversation. And to Jessica's point, I think it's fair to say that you know, as awareness of the changes broadens, there will be more you know, desire and participation in some communities just organically as folks realize that's where the opportunity is best to provide their input.
Thanks, Eric. Next question. So with the significant shifts that we're seeing, provincial or local government staff have been advised in a number of instances that they will need to seek legal advice on kind of implementing and enacting many of these changes through bylaw. And I think the question is whether there is any consideration underway around providing examples of low density zones that meet the small scale multi-unit legislation that have been vetted by provincial legal counsel to avoid this situation. I think this isn't, I'll just kind of acknowledge, you know, certainly where we can, we look for opportunities to create, to try and help provide input and tools and resources. In the instance of providing legal advice, we do encourage local governments to seek that for their own municipalities and regional districts. Each area, each set of bylaws is unique, and you'll want advice that is reflective of local circumstances and local conditions. I don't know if anybody else on the team has anything that they want to add to that.
Yeah, I would just add that I think the small scale multi-unit housing policy manual goes a long way to be pretty clear about what is expected in a zoning bylaw to meet the requirements. And further that, you know, I think some of the instances we've seen where local governments where we've suggested they speak to legal counsel is how to apply the requirements to existing zones. But in terms of, you know, low density zones that meet the requirements, the policy manual does go quite a ways in helping local governments work through that process, and we'll try to work through that as well in the technical webinars on SMA next week.
Great, thanks. The next question is more of a comment, just noting that the city of Burnaby has a tenant assistant policy that's provided a lot of really important benefits to the city, and just sort of noting the importance of the province considering these kinds of initiatives as we're moving forward with our various pieces of work. And I'll just acknowledge that, you know, we are keenly aware of both Burnaby's policy and similar policies that are held by other local governments. And certainly we are keeping these kinds of things top of mind as we go through our various policy processes. The next question, Leslie, is in relation, it looks like the ACC, to what level is an economic analysis required and how is it assessed given it doesn't need to be approved by the inspector of municipalities like a DCC bylaw would be?
Right. So the rules in the ACC and for setting the amenity cost charges themselves are actually based on legislative and policy requirements of the inspector. So the rules themselves for setting the charges drive out the need for an analysis. So for example, determining the portion of the costs that will be covered by local governments the portion of the cost that will be imposed on new development, and then the municipal assist factor in relation to that. So there's also a consideration, or local governments need to consider whether or not these costs will deter development. So like DCCs, the consultation requirements and the ACC are intended to provide an avenue to hear feedback from the development community to understand whether or not the cost will deter development. And again, that analysis is meant to provide local governments with an understanding of kind of the broader landscape of the cost of development and other local government charges to ensure that their the ACCs are set at a rate that won't impact development viability.
Thank you. Next question is regarding steps that the province may be taking to reflect increased school age populations based on increasing density. And I will just acknowledge, this is a big question, and certainly, as you increase density, there are attendant impacts on communities and neighborhoods, and we are aware of these. We are in close conversation with our colleagues across government, both in the Ministry of Education, also places like the Ministry of Transportation, and we continue to monitor and consider these kinds of questions. But your point is well made, and certainly it's top of mind for us as well. Avery, we have a specific question here on, it looks like, the application of small-scale multi-unit housing requirements to single-family strata sites, both bare land and conventional. And the question is whether or not the small-scale multi-unit housing requirements apply to those strata sites.
Thanks. Yeah, the small-scale multi-unit housing requirements apply regardless of tenure. So they apply to all restricted zones, regardless of the type of subdivision that created the parcels in that zone. But strata corporations may have or may make bylaws regarding the use and enjoyment of strata lots. And so that could include the type of buildings that could be constructed on a bare land strata lot.
Thanks. And I'll keep you on the screen for this next question. Will there be an ability to pass small-scale multi-unit housing bylaws that have restrictive tenure? So, for example, can you rezone with a percentage of the gross floor area tied to mandatory rental or employee restricted, for example? So can you limit by tenure to some degree?
Right. So I think rental only zoning could be applied. However, for these other examples, I would say that the legislation restricts the ability to unreasonably restrict or prohibit the development of small-scale multi-unit housing. And it also restricts the ability to use density bonusing, except for in the situation of the 6-unit zoning, where 1 unit can be achieved through density bonusing for either special needs or affordable housing.
Thanks, Avery. This next question links through to housing targets. And so, Bindi, I may ask you to weigh in on this one a little bit, but the question is, what avenues are available to municipalities to help them achieve some of their below market targets, where there presumably is a housing target applied, particularly in TOAs where there are minimum allowable densities being set?
Yeah, I mean, I think whether it's targets or whatever the driver is, everybody is doing their level best to support meeting the needs of a wide, diverse range of housing. I'm not sure if there are specific barriers that the question is trying to get at. But the assumption around all of this work is that the existing relationships that are already ongoing with not-for-profit housing providers, with BC Housing, with a massive amount of increased funding that's gone into BC Housing to really start to address some of that unmet need, that all of that continues. So I'm not sure in the question if there's a specific barrier that's a challenge or if it's just asking, are we doing something extra in this space? I would suggest not over and above the increased investment that's already come out to support affordable housing and the range of other things that are under the Homes for People plan.
Thanks, Cindy. The next question that we have is a small scale multi-unit housing question. So the understanding is that secondary suites do not count as small scale multi-unit housing units for the purposes of the minimum 3 or 4 units per lot, which can make the inclusion of ADUs challenging. And the policy manual doesn't appear to speak to this. Do you have examples of draft zones that meet the intent of the legislation? Avery, can I ask you to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. So that's a misunderstanding. Secondary suites can be counted towards the unit level density requirements for the small scale multi-unit housing zones. And the policy manual does go into it. And the policy manual suggests rather than limiting housing form. So the legislation doesn't speak to housing form, it doesn't require housing form, but the policy manual suggests that local governments take a flexible approach and allow as many different configurations of housing forms in these zones as they can on the lots in their jurisdictions and in their neighborhoods that make sense. So for example, that they would, if 4 units were required, that they would allow a duplex with 2 suites, or a triplex with an ADU, or just a houseplex that has 4 units in it. And so the recommended approach is that you allow as many different housing form configurations as you can, but certainly secondary suites can be counted towards that unit count.
Great, thank you. Next question, Leslie, is a CAC-ACC question for communities that have a CAC policy in place. Can they continue to use that approach rather than enacting an ACC?
So amenity cost charges, it is an enabling tool, and it's intended to support the shift to the proactive pre-zoning planning and land use framework. So it's really up to a local government to make choices about putting in place an ACC and then seek legal advice on tools that aren't more specifically contemplated or regulated by the legislation.
Thank you. Next question, Avery, are you able to expand a little bit on the large site exemption rationale?
Sure. So that lot size of 4,050 meters squared was picked as these larger lot sizes are more suited to higher density in urban areas, and then in rural areas as a way to distinguish between single family and rural residential zones, as some zoning bylaws don't make that distinction.
Thank you. Leslie, between that period, kind of post July 1st and until such a time as a local government has adopted an ACC bylaw, is there any mechanism that a community can use to secure amenity contributions?
So we understand it will take some time to undertake the requirements to implement an ACC bylaw. So, and until those requirements are met and that bylaw is adopted, that at that point is when those charges or charges can be collected. Where local government has a density bonus program in place, many contributions can continue to be collected through that. And then, as previously noted, local governments do have other authorities under the legislation, and it'd be important to seek legal advice to determine what may be approaches available to the local government.
Great, thanks. Eric, I think we've responded to this one, but maybe it's just worth saying just for clarity, because I see it come up a few times. Can you just speak once more to in an instance where a rezoning application aligns with an OCP, can the full suite of readings be done in one meeting?
So if the rezoning meets the criteria, meets for not having a public hearing, then that's our understanding as well. Again, further to my earlier comment, I would recommend making sure that both your internal advice and your own procedure bylaws and meeting policies sort of all are on the same page in that regard. The caveat here is that there might be a circumstance where your bylaw requires approval from another source or another authority rather, such as the Ministry of Transportation, if it's proximate to a controlled access highway. So you just need to kind of, I guess, look to the details of the bylaw in question before, applying that timeline broadly.
Thank you. Sorry, my screen just dropped back down to the bottom. Avery, can you speak to whether covenants prohibiting secondary suites or similar will be invalidated under the small scale multi-unit housing legislation?
The legislation does not address covenants, but it's certainly on our radar as something that can restrict the development of this type of housing.
Great, thank you. Next question regarding First Nations consultation and whether or not they are aware of this legislation. And certainly as part of our consultation on all of the legislation that was introduced, Bills 44, 6, and 7, there has been ongoing outreach and engagement with First Nations, including the First Nations Leadership Council, and we will continue to engage in that space as may be necessary and appropriate. Next question is it just switched on me. Avery, can you talk a little bit about some of the thinking about retaining urban tree canopy or tree protection efforts in the context of the small scale multi-unit housing amendments?
Sure. Yeah. So just to say that the site standards that we've recommended suggest a very flexible approach to things like site backs and lot coverage, and they recommend 3 stories in most cases to ensure that the most positive development environment for this type of housing, but that local governments are required to consider that those policy recommendations when amending their zoning bylaws and in implementation, and that we understand local governments will continue to take other municipal priorities into consideration when they're drafting their bylaws.
Thanks, Avery. The next question, also a small scale multi-unit housing question. If a municipality combines their SMU bylaw amendments with other related zoning amendments, then is it necessary or may a public hearing be held?
Yeah, I think what the legislation does is prohibit local governments from holding a public hearing where the amendments are solely to meet the requirements of the small scale multi-unit housing legislation.
Thank you. Acknowledging that off-street parking isn't, local government can't set off-street parking requirements in TOD areas, is it possible to have parking maximums? Teresa, is this something that you want to start with?
I'm gonna call in a lifeline and ask Mark to help me with that one.
Absolutely. Mark, have you got
Certainly, yes. Good question. The legislation allows local governments to, by bylaw, require owners, occupiers of any land, building, and other structure to provide off-street parking and loading spaces. But the Bill 47 legislation imposes a restriction on that only in transit-oriented areas, just in relation to parking spaces for residential uses. The intention there was the intention behind the Bill 47 legislation was to shift sort of the decision making about the provision of off-street parking for residential uses to developers to make decisions that are context specific to the development and the local conditions. But in terms of new policy approaches and ideas like maximums, suggest running those past your solicitor for advice on how to apply the legislation in that specific context.
Thanks, Mark. Next question is short and sweet, and I'll maybe ask both Avery and Teresa to respond in brief to what happens if deadlines aren't met. Maybe start with you, Avery.
Sure. So if the compliance deadline for small scale multi-unit housing requirements isn't met and no extension has been granted, then the Minister of Housing does have the authority to grant a ministerial override to the zoning bylaw to put conditions in place that would allow small scale multi-unit housing to be developed until such time as a local government passes their own compliant bylaw amendments.
Thanks. Teresa?
Yeah, similar approach on the TOAs. However, we will send a letter to the local government informing them that they haven't complied and giving them 90 days to rectify that. Otherwise, the province will step in and do the designation itself.
Thanks, Teresa. So just this next question is in relation to kind of the ongoing and outstanding question that folks have about the various legislative items that are through. Absolutely understand there are lots of questions and these are ongoing. We are in the process. We have developed a number of resources, so would encourage you to look at, for example, the policy manuals for TOAs and small scale multi-unit housing. We are continuing the webinar series and we will continue to provide these kinds of forums for as long as they're needed. We'll also be developing guidance on the various topics and making those available to local governments too. So we are in the early days of this. We recognize that this is a big lift for everyone, and we will be looking to provide as much useful information out to folks as we can. And certainly if there are specific things or specific tools that you would find particularly valuable, we are always interested in hearing that and, taking our cue from you in that space. The next question is in regards to the timing of an ACC bylaw, Leslie, and essentially when should the first ACC bylaw come forward in the context of all of these other pieces?
So the ACC framework does not include, there's no specific requirements in that, and I completely appreciate this question of timing. So it was left flexible so local governments could determine how best to approach this. So, we understand that there might be a desire to have bylaws in place earlier than later. And so it could be that an ACC bylaw is developed and then updated once, as the new requirements come into play, appreciating that every time a bylaw is updated, more work needs to be done. Eric, I don't know if you have anything to add in terms of the H&R tool and understanding kind of calculating or estimating 20-year housing needs or zone capacity to speak to that might be helpful.
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. That's one of the reasons we're looking to get the H&R guidance and method out as soon as possible early this year, so that local governments prior to the end of 2025, have that better sense of what kind of zone capacity they're looking at. I think, for communities where the small scale multi-unit housing applies relatively broadly, it's probably fair to say in a lot of cases that will help in a really meaningful, if not complete way, to meet that initial zone capacity for the first cycle.
Thank you both. Turning to the next question, it's a question about the ACC, how ACC charges are set. So Leslie, maybe the question I think is primarily around whether the ACC charge is predicated on land value lift, similar to how we've seen some local governments apply a community amenity contribution charge. Can you maybe speak in brief to how a charge is set under the ACC?
Yeah, so the basis of an amenity cost charge is similar to the basis of a development cost charge. So it's based on the capital costs of the amenities, and this allows for that upfront planning to happen. Be very difficult to base it on land value capture. So the guidance will be in relation to the provisions of the legislation, which again are based on capital costs as opposed to another basis that is not contemplated by the framework, as per your question about whether guidance will address land value capture.
Thanks. And while I have you on the screen, just next question is more of a note that there are a number of local governments that are pretty keen to move ahead with their ACC and DCC bylaws. And if you maybe want to speak a little bit to when we're anticipating guidance, perhaps both interim and kind of more comprehensive.
Right, so completely appreciate this point, absolutely. We are working with our municipal affairs colleagues on collaborating on developing the guidance. And so those in the that work in local government infrastructure and finance, so under the inspector's office, we're getting that guidance as quickly as we can. So the interim guidance is slated for I believe late January, early February. The more comprehensive guidance, the approach that we ourselves and our municipal affairs colleagues want to take is really engaging with the Development Finance Review Committee. So this includes developers and local governments and other experts. So that guidance will take some time and is more slated for summer. A lot of the, as I mentioned, a lot of the requirements in that are based on both policies and legislative provisions in the DCC framework. So looking at the DCC best practices guide and kind of the principles that underpin that guide is also a starting point as well, if that's helpful at all. But thank you, appreciate the point, and we will work as quickly as we can on that.
Thanks, Leslie. The next question here is referring again to the question of tree canopy retention in the context of densification and the attendant infrastructure. I think we've provided some responses in that space already. I'm looking, Avery, to see in particular if you had anything that you wanted to add to your previous comments in this regard. No, Teresa?
Not really, other than to say part of the reason that we have recommended pretty minimal parking requirements is to reduce the amount of paved surfaces, which will contribute to the same goals. And then again, the requirement is for local governments to consider this policy guidance in the context of their own local conditions.
Thanks very much. Public hearing question, Eric. In the circumstances where a public hearing is not required, can council direct staff to hold a public meeting or make that a requirement for an applicant to hold their own public meeting?
So our changes don't speak to this question explicitly. Certainly within based on your own internal legal advice and your own policies and procedures, that would be an option that might be available in some circumstances. Again, though, I'd return back to the my earlier comment that about the intent of the legislation, which was really about the importance of ensuring that the right amounts and supply of housing are moved expeditiously through the system, and that there's a real desire not to relitigate at every juncture every single housing project. So certainly there might be appropriate moments for extra meetings or community involvement in some cases. But I think, from the province's point of view, that the rationale for removing public hearings in these specific cases was because there'd already been engagement and community feedback at the OCP stage, and it didn't need to be once again relitigated. So would urge just some consideration of the context when making that kind of decision.
Thanks, Ed. The next question is in relation to small scale multi-unit housing and transit scheduling, Avery. So recognizing that scheduled service levels can change kind of over the course of a year, is the onus on municipalities to update which lots would be captured by that kind of 6-unit requirement as service levels change?
Thanks. So neither the legislation nor the policy manual direct local governments to ongoing updates of their zoning bylaw. So I guess the expectation is that your bylaw is on side with the legislation. And when local governments update that, there will be a lot of factors that factor in terms of operational capacity, et cetera. The only real compliance deadline in the legislation is for a wholesale amendment to your zoning bylaw to meet these requirements by June 30th.
Thanks, Avery. And then, so Bill 44, so just looking again at small scale multi-unit housing where parking is prohibited or parking minimums, is there any reason a municipality can't incentivize to voluntarily get parking?
So Bill 44 prevents local governments from requiring parking minimums for the 6-unit requirements. It doesn't speak to incentivizing parking. It does make recommendations for each unit level sort of density as to what parking minimums or parking requirements would be. Those were set to ensure maximum potential for development. And we know that parking is probably the thing that most impacts development viability for developments this small. So certainly our encouragement is to require as little parking as can be managed. We'll leave it there.
Thanks, Avery. Eric, can you speak to why notice is required in instances where a public hearing is not going to be held?
Sure. And I'm glad this was asked because this is a frequent point of misunderstanding, I think. Looking closely at the legislation for public notice, the title of that section happens to be notice if public hearing not held, which seems to imply that the notice needs to say, hey, we're not holding a public hearing, when in fact, looking at the section, the wording of the legislative language itself, as opposed to just the title, the legislative language talks about the notice discussing and providing information about the purpose and the timing of the bylaw and when it will be received first reading. So just to recap, the notice doesn't need to make a big deal about saying that there's no public hearing. What the notice needs to do is say, hey, this zoning bylaw is advancing, this is what it does, and these are the next steps. So I think it's a bit of a perception issue, kind of a little bit where the unfortunate wording of the wayfinding piece in the legislation sends people a bit astray.
Thanks, Eric. Next question is regarding phasing in periods for ACCs. So Leslie, is a phase-in period required or can an ACC be implemented immediately? I'm wondering too if this is speaking a little bit to in-stream protections.
So ACC programs can be implemented at any time as long as a bylaw is adopted. There are rules regarding in-stream projects. Basically, if application has been received on or by the date of that the ACC is adopted, then the ACC would not apply to those projects.
Great, thanks. And we've actually got a run on ACC related questions here. Can the ACC program be utilized for affordable housing capital projects?
So no, the ACC tool is not intended to be used for housing capital costs.
Right. And while I've got you here too, can you just speak to whether the ACCs can be citywide like a DCC, or are they area specific only?
Yeah, so local governments are required to determine the areas that make sense for the specific amenity cost charges. So they could be either citywide or area specific, depending on the type of amenity for which the charge is being collected or imposed.
Great, thanks. The next question is in relation to MOTI approvals. So will extensions be available for the required zoning changes to accommodate MOTI approvals within kind of a controlled access highway? I can maybe provide just a note there that we are working very closely with the Ministry of Transportation. They are very aware of all of these zoning bylaws, or that some of them may be coming to them for review. And the intention is that that review process will not unduly delay local government kind of updates to their zoning bylaw. Avery, do you have anything else that you want to add to that?
No, that's great.
Great. Okay, that was easy. Next question, is there any guidance for local governments on how to proceed if the required density changes aren't supported by local First Nations? So I would say certainly, you know, there is a long-standing interest that government has in supporting local governments and First Nations and working together, and to the best possible extent, looking for support on land use planning changes. And we would encourage folks to work with their First Nations neighbors in that space. And on these changes, the Ministry of Municipal Affairs has some kind of resources and supports that are available in this space to just help build relationships. And we would encourage folks to take a look at those and reach out. And certainly we're always available to kind of help where possible. I don't know if anybody else on the team had anything that they wanted to add to that. I'm scanning across the top of my screen. Okay, seeing nothing. Next question, Teresa, can you speak a little bit to the rationale for designating some of the TOAs immediately and leaving some until June?
Sure, and I'll shout out to my friend Matea. Hi, Matea. The way those were selected was the ones that had immediate designation are in communities that have already adopted plans or policies that are transit supported. So in your case, the Canby plan, the Broadway plan, that's how the split was made. Those are all reflective of communities that already have transit supported policies or plans in place.
Thanks, Teresa. Question from Karen, in cases where affordable housing is being secured through delegated approvals, a housing agreement still requires council approval. Is the province considering changing this? No, this isn't something that we are currently contemplating. Next question, can land acquisition for affordable housing be included in an ACC program? Leslie, this is similar to the one that you just answered.
Mm-hmm. So as per previous answer, the ACC is not intended to be used for affordable housing, and the charges need to be applied for funding in relation to to a particular amenity underneath that amenity cost charge. So there need to be a relationship between the land for which an ACC is being imposed and the actual amenity project that you are looking to fund.
Great, thank you. Avery, this next question I think is for you. If a local government is looking to exempt a hazard area, can you just speak a little bit to what kind of assessment is needed?
Sure. Yeah, maybe I'll just say that there's an exemption for hazard areas that's defined in regulation. It's described in the policy manual. We can talk about it in the technical webinar next week. But essentially, if there's a hazard area where like the risk can't be mitigated, it's well documented by qualified. You have a report from a qualified professional. and an increase to density would increase the threat or the risk from that hazard area. It can be exempt. And then DPAs can still be used for different types of hazards, and all that information is included in the policy manual.
Great. Thank you. Teresa, is there anything in that space that you wanted to reference in relation to TOAs?
Sorry, I had too many screens open.
No, that's okay.
Yeah, I think Avery covered it really well. Just looking at the question again, there will be some hazard areas. Bill 47 only addresses height and density, and all your other local authorities for floodplains and those kind of things are still in place. Right?
Yep. Great. Thank you. Leslie, where a municipality has a CAC policy or bylaw in place, can those be ported over to an equivalent ACC bylaw without requiring some of those additional steps?
So because amenity cost charges is a new tool with specific legislative requirements, those requirements must be fulfilled as part of implementing and adopting an ACC bylaw. But of course, a local government could contemplate what they're currently, the types of amenities that they need and they are currently collecting for. But again, all of the required legislative steps need to be fulfilled.
Great, thank you. And Avery, the next question is around whether or not a local government can restrict stratification on small-scale multi-unit houses.
Sure. So the legislation doesn't change any of the authorities around strata titling. So new developments can be strata titled by the developer as they are now through the land title office. The stratification of existing units, like conversion of existing units, will still require local government approval before a strata plan can be filed in the land title office. Secondary suites that are secondary to a primary dwelling unit still can't be strata titled as per the BC Building Code. And I guess just to say that we would encourage local governments not to restrict the tenure of small scale multi-unit housing if they can, and make that as flexible as possible, and that they're prohibited under the legislation from unreasonably restricting or prohibiting the development of small scale multi-unit housing.
Thanks, Avery. Teresa, we've got a fairly detailed TOA question up next. I'm not sure if you can see it on your screen. I'll maybe just in sum, there's kind of 3 key questions. Does a commercial requirement contribute to the density minimum, or is the minimum always strictly residential? Can each municipality independently define residential use in its zoning bylaw? And should institutional properties be considered exempt?
So great question. I think the easiest answer is that the minimum density, FAR, and height is not restricted to residential use. So it can be, so we're not saying that you have to have 5 FSR of residential. The entire mixed use building will need to be at least 5 FSR. So that can include a mix of office, commercial, retail, institutional. So each local government has all the authority that they need to set both the use and the tenure within that density requirement. Mark, did I get that right?
Yes, that's correct. Thanks, Teresa.
Great, thank you. Okay, Avery, small scale multi-unit question. Can a local government set a larger minimum lot size than what is referenced in the policy manual?
Yeah, I think if I understand the question right, it's asking if local governments can be more permissive than what's in the legislation or in the policy manual, and that's always certainly the case. So as long as the requirements are met, if they want to make policies that are more permissive, that's fine.
Thank you. Next question. So you indicated manufactured home park zones are exempt. What about zones that allow for manufactured homes, single detached dwellings, and 2-unit dwellings? I'm assuming that this is in relation to the small scale multi-unit housing.
That's a good question. The definition of a restricted zone is single detached dwellings and duplex dwellings in some cases. We'll have to give that one a think and get back to you, Paul.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Eric, we've got a question from Karen regarding whether or not the requirement for public hearings around the designation of heritage buildings is something that's being considered in any manner.
It's definitely on our radar. We've been aware of this. As you are alluding to, it wasn't included in the legislation in the fall, but it's something that you know, we're giving some thought to.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks for the question, Karen. Teresa, can you speak a little bit to this next question, which observes that TOAs are to be designated through standalone bylaws? Can you talk a little bit about what this bylaw is intended to do and how it relates to an official community plan?
Yeah, absolutely. The bylaw is intended to acknowledge the requirement, right? So we're asking that it be passed in bylaw and include the map so that there's a clear indication of the area, the minimum prescribed area. The Bill 47 does not require cities to update their OCPs for this specific provision. However, it's good land use planning to do that. As you update your OCP, you'll be working on your own land use policies, your own small area plans for these transited areas. And when you roll those, as those are approved by council, those will need to be included. Well, they should probably be included in the OCP, right, before any kind of rezoning comes into effect. So just standard good land use planning practices should take care of that.
Great. Thank you, Teresa. Next question is one I think that you've already largely answered, Leslie, regarding whether or not CACs can continue to be used while an ACC bylaw is being developed.
Yeah, so it's you know, the LTA doesn't specifically regulate CAC, so it's you know, the ministry cannot speak directly to them. You know, this is one of the where local governments have broad authorities and seek legal advice about how to use those authorities. The amenity cost charge is now specifically set out in legislation, and so that's where the guidance and the ministry can more fully speak to the intention of the tool, which is intended to complement the shift to small scale multi-unit housing requirements and more proactive zoning.
Great, thank you. Next question, and I'm not actually sure who's best positioned to answer this. Can developers enter into new building schemes under Section 220 of the LTA to limit density? Avery, do you want to? Yeah.
They can, as legislation is currently written, and it's on our radar, something that could limit development.
Okay, great, thank you. Teresa, are you able to speak about whether there's a recommended approach to land consolidation in an instance where the majority of a large assembly might be located outside of a TOA?
Sure, yeah, the legislation, the regulation speaks to parcels. If a parcel is captured within that prescribed distance, or if it's bisected by the prescribed districts, if it's partially within, it's wholly within. So the strictest interpretation would be to stick to the current lot configurations in place at the effective date of the provision. However, local governments will certainly have the authority and the autonomy to expand that as those lot assemblies are put in place to secure development rights. But the strictest interpretation is it applies to the parcel. in its current, in the configuration of the effective date of the regulations.
Okay, thanks, Teresa. Avery, there's a follow-up question to the previous one that we covered regarding minimum and maximum lot sizes. There's an example here. So for example, can we set a minimum lot size of 400 square meters, not 280, and permit 4 units?
Yeah, I think as long as the zoning bylaw meets the requirement in the legislation, so on any given lot size, if the unit level density that's permitted is aligned with the minimum lot sizes in the legislation, then that's fine.
Okay, thank you. We've answered the next question already. The subsequent question here, will the ministry be modeling long-term impact of some of these changes on tree canopy cover and flood risk? I will say we're not currently planning on doing kind of province-wide modeling, but we are overall intending to monitor the implementation and kind of outcomes of this legislation. And certainly, you know, we'll be looking for feedback and input into that process. And that's something that we will be looking to do. You know, we'll be starting that process fairly soon, and we'll be looking to do it kind of over a longer medium-term basis. So, you know, we expect that a variety of different outcomes will get picked up and understood better through that work. The next question is regarding why public notice needs to be given on applications where there isn't a public hearing. I think we've already covered this one. So Eric, unless you had anything further that you wanted to add,
Well,
I will.
only that I realized I don't think I'd said specifically what the purpose of the notice was, or expanded on that at least. It's really to make sure that folks are aware, and that if they do, for transparency purposes, and that they can, you know, even if there's no public hearing, that they can, you know, follow the development along and provide comments through other means to staff or elected officials.
Yeah, okay, thanks. And having said that, I actually just noticed that we are at time, and I will acknowledge that we have answered roughly 80 questions again. So it looks like that's kind of the number that we're able to get through in kind of this particular time period. But recognizing that there are quite a number of open questions still, so we will take these questions away and look at them, and you know, where we're seeing emerging themes and kind of aggregation of questions, we will either look to provide FAQs, or we'll hold some additional kind of Q&A webinars just specific to these kinds of questions. So please stay tuned, because we have a strong and ongoing interest in providing all of you folks with the information that you need to be able to do this work. There is no question too small, no question too big. So we do very much welcome them. Bindi, appreciating that we're at time, I wonder if you just want to say a few closing words?
Yeah, thanks so much, Jessica. Thank you to everybody on the panel for all your time, energy, and answers to questions. And most of all, thank you to all of you who participated. We really appreciate the job that you have and the role that you hold. I think we're all working together to the best of our ability to really address the housing crisis in the province, and to the greatest extent possible. As Jessica said, we really are your partners in trying to implement this in the best way that we can. So stay tuned. More information and more opportunities are coming your way. And I wish you all a good rest of your day.